Hello and welcome to All the Things. I am Monique Dusan.
And I am Krista Traeger, also known as Theology Mom. And this is the show where we talk about all the things
Related to God, the Bible, and real life. Welcome to Saturday.
Yes.
Yes.
This is, we should probably tell people this is a pre-recorded show. As this is playing, we will have just finished speaking at the Maven conference.
Yes.
So we're both getting to do sessions. You're doing a main platform talk. I'm doing a breakout session.
Yes.
And what are you speaking on again?
I'm speaking on critical theory.
Okay.
And I've kind of put together a talk that Neil Shinvey and I did together a couple of years ago in Canada. And we called it Woke Roots and Woke Fruit. This talk it's called Critical Theory, the ideology that's poisoning everything, or something like that. I think Brett came up with the title, but I'm going to look at a bit of the history of critical theory, and then we'll look at what's happening today in critical theory, and what are the implications of that, and why this should matter to Christians.
Cool.
Yeah.
And if people want to know more about the Maven conference, it's where you will be in the North Dallas area and in Indianapolis later in the year. So go check out mavenconferences.com.
Maven Conferences, I believe it is .com.
Right.
And if you are attending in North Dallas or in Indianapolis, you can actually hear Neil Shinvey talk about critical theory.
Oh, cool.
Yes, and then
That'll be the first time I'm going to meet him in person.
Yeah. He's really tall.
I am not.
I will be doing a breakout. I'll be doing 2 breakouts on queer theory at each of those conferences, and you're doing a breakout on walking in unity.
Yeah, I'm doing the same talk for all 3 conferences.
Me too.
Yeah.
Well, except for the first one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we want to say thanks to our moderators for keeping the peace in the chat, and we also want to remind everyone about our book clubs. Now is the time to go sign up for the Center for Biblical Unity book clubs. They're going to start the week of March 17th. You can find out all the information and see what books we're reading. Remind us again what book which one you're leading.
The Queering of the American Child.
Okay. James Lindsay is a co-author on that.
James Lindsay is not a co-author.
Yeah.
He did the foreword.
Oh.
And he did the foreword, but he didn't co-author it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he might have contributed like info, but it's written by
someone else.
Yes, I cannot think of his name right now, but yeah.
But you can find out all the information. Just go to centerforbiblicalunity.com/book clubs. Okay, so tonight our guest is our friend Eric Muldrow,
the one and only,
from Code Red Conversations.
Yes. He is a longtime friend of the ministry. He's been on Off Code. He's been here with us on All the Things.
A couple of times.
A couple of times, yes. And we are glad to have him back to talk about policing, and in particular to talk about how do we talk to our children about policing, especially if you have teens. How should you encourage or, instruct your teen to talk to a police officer when they are pulled over? In my community, in my culture, Black culture a lot, this has been a huge conversation for us. Like, I remember my mom giving us the talk. Normally when people think about the talk, you think about birds and bees.
Mm-hmm.
No, the talk for us is, what happens if you get pulled over or if you get confronted by a police officer. And so we'll talk about that too. Like, is it needed to have, quote unquote, the talk? And
some of the pros and cons of that, and thinking about authority from a Christian point of view. And Eric just brings a ton of wisdom, and is a brother in the Lord, and former law enforcement, former military. So always glad to have him on the show. So.
Yeah, Kevin's going to be jealous that we're having a conversation with him.
All right, with that, let's welcome Eric Muldrow back to the show. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, thanks, y'all. Thanks for having me.
Hello. Well, thanks for joining us. Why don't we just start off with you telling our viewers, our listeners, who you are. Tell us a little bit about yourself, since it's been a while since you've been on.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a minute. I had a pretty eventful last couple of years, but we'll save that conversation for another day.
I didn't know if you
Anyway,
wanted me to put it out, so I was like,
that's it. That's all I'm saying. But I appreciate the respect give me the grace to say it or not. I definitely appreciate that. But a little bit about me, especially in regard to this conversation. After leaving the Army in 1992, where I served as a medic for 4 years, my law enforcement career started in Westville Correctional Center. Westville was a maximum security prison right outside of Gary, Indiana, about 40 miles. And if anyone is familiar with that location, that's about 60 miles outside of Chicago. So I'll just put it out there. My background I wasn't raised in the hood. So getting out of the Army and then venturing into corrections, working in a maximum security prison, and we're talking early 90s. So you're talking the height of the crime, when the crime rate in our country was at its all-time high, basically. So I had a trial by fire for those 3 years, 3.5 years that I worked at that prison. We had one unit that was known as Gladiator Dorm. That's how bad it was. So it was I was drinking out of a fire hose as far as learning how to deal with the criminal element. Fast forward to 1995, me and my family moved out here where I'm currently at, to Las Vegas. A year later, I started working for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department as a corrections officer. I worked there at the county jail. I worked here at the county jail for 10 years. In 2006, I decided to switch things up a bit and I transferred out to the patrol side of the house. And I finished out my career as a police officer. I worked as a defensive tactics instructor, firearms instructor, an active shooter response instructor. I worked as a crisis negotiation on the crisis intervention team, where you are given or you learn special skills in order to deal with people who are in a mental health crisis. You learn specific skills to de-escalate. And in I retired in 2014. So over the years, especially with the Trayvon Martin incident, that was kind of like the incident that got the ball rolling for me to have my ears up to see how things were going in the culture when people were discussing the issues related to interacting with law enforcement or authority figures in the public and how people should act. You couple that with the Michael Brown case and the George Floyd incident in more recent years. In 2020, I started the YouTube channel and my business, Code Red Conversations, where I specifically started addressing issues related to the culture and policing and how those two entities should interact. So that's, in a nutshell, that's basically what brings me here with y'all today.
That's great. And we have benefited from your wisdom over the years. And something that I guess let's just get it started right at the top. We're wanting to offer parents and other influencers of children, if they're school teachers or youth leaders, not just parents, but any adult who has children in their lives, this topic might come up about policing, about justice. And so let's start with just a very basic question about pullovers. Like, what is some of the most common reasons that people get pulled over? Is it a turn signal at 10 o'clock at night when they're really hungry?
For not using a turn signal.
The reality is, and let me kind of set the table with this comment here. I want people to understand that having worked in law enforcement for an extended period of time, basically over 20 years, I'm well aware that there are officers who should not be there. There are officers who have ill intentions. There are bad cops all over in every agency. I think it's safe to say. So there's the reality to, you may run into a cop who has ill will. There's no getting around that. But I would argue that the vast majority of situations that or times people come in contact with the police, there are good and just reasons for doing so. There's so many factors that go into a police stop. It could be a simple traffic violation. It could be you speeding. It could be an unsafe lane change. It could be the broken tail light. And yeah, that's an actual reality. Those are good, just reasons, because as surprising as it may be for some, I would say that throughout the court, overall in our country, driving is not a right, like a legal right. It is a privilege that is granted to us. And if we were going to drive, that means we have to follow certain rules and laws. If you don't have if you have a busted taillight, that could lead to an accident. If you're speeding, somebody could get ran over. Are there jurisdictions in places where people have abused that power because they want to, for financial gain? No question about it. But I would argue that the vast majority of times when we get stopped, most people get stopped. I can say that in my lifetime. When I've gotten pulled over, it was for totally just reasons. Back in the day when I was driving, especially before I became a police officer, I'd be driving with no insurance to get pulled over, or my plate would be unregistered or expired. You get pulled over, that's my fault. So those are legit reasons why you might get pulled over. And I say all that because the public conversation is that the primary reason they pull somebody over, especially a Black person or a minority in general, is because the cop is trying to, manipulate you or abuse you. And I want to argue that that's just not the case. Incidents like that do occur, but the majority of times, and I would even argue that the facts and studies and research out there would demonstrate that it's primarily because the cop was totally just and justified in pulling us over.
So I need to know, like, I don't know if it's a myth or not, but do police officers have like a quota that they have to of tickets they have to, turn in by the end of the month?
Right. This is what they would do. Like I didn't work in traffic. We had traffic sections, like the guys on the motorcycles. They were like traffic cops, and they had a certain number of tickets that they were expected to write throughout the court because that's all they did.
Okay.
Were traffic citations, unless they're nearby when some major incident was going down, a robbery, a gun call, and they're in the area and they're free, they'll respond to that too. But 90% of their job is stopping people who are violating traffic laws. So to some degree, there are cops who do have a standard, a quota, a limit, how many tickets are expected to write. I can't remember what the number was. But for the average patrol officer, we aren't given that. At least that's the standard here in Las Vegas. We weren't given that. There were times where, a whole month I didn't write one ticket. And my sergeant would pull me in the office and be like, Eric, your stats are kind of low this month. And so he would say, maybe you can work on that. And I'd be like, Sarge, let me be real with you. I'm not trying to be mean or disrespectful, but if I pull somebody over and I think they have a good reason for not paying, not not having insurance, or their registration or the vehicle being unregistered, I'll tell them I'm not giving them a ticket. I'm just not doing it. Especially the areas I worked were pretty low income areas. So my heart would always go out to a lot of these folks because I know how expensive a ticket like that was. I mentioned earlier, before I hired on with Metro, I think it was like in 94. I mean, not 94. It was like in 90. It was early 96 because I hired on with Las Vegas Metro Police at the end of like December of 1996. And I had gotten a ticket for no insurance, no proof of insurance. I didn't even have any because that's how broke I was back in the day. And that ticket was like $350. And that was just too much for me at that time. And it took everything in my power. I was scrimping and saving, and I was paying that ticket each and every month, terrified that if I missed it, I'd get locked up. And that always stuck with me. I always had a little bit of compassion to say, man, if I write somebody a ticket who's got a minimum wage job of $300 or $500 ticket, I don't want to totally throw their whole world into a tailspin. So I would always be a little nicer. But I know that's a long way of explaining. I think there are depending on what section you work as a police officer, there might be a standard as far as how many citations or tickets or even arrests, maybe. I don't know. I can't speak for every agency. But I know when it comes to traffic stops here with the Las Vegas Metro Police, they did expect the traffic police officers to write a certain number of tickets every month.
I just was wondering because every month around the certain same time of the month, we know, oh, they got to meet their quota because now they have these little checkpoints and they're
Mhm.
always hiding on this one corner. Last weekend of the month, they got to hide on the corner. Why? Why
This
y'all
is
got?
usually how it works is in the beginning of the month. This is how it works here. In the beginning of the month, let's say let's say they said they expect you to write 100 tickets. I'm just throwing that number out. So a lot of guys would go and do everything they can. They would wait in certain areas, wait for people to come by, and they would speed, and they would get all their tickets in the first couple of weeks. And then the rest of the month, they can kind of do a few things that they want to do. So a lot of guys would really go in hard in the beginning of the month. And then you have some guys who would wait till the end of the month and then they would start writing their tickets.
I thank you for answering that because
I'm
I
just
needed to
saying.
know. I needed to know because we all talk about it.
Yeah.
I needed to know because it's just been a myth, but now I know. Yeah.
Yeah. At least, and you guys are in LA?
Yeah.
LA and Vegas, we have a lot of similar practices when it comes to policing. We train together oftentimes at different agencies. Like I've been to down in LA when I was doing gang intelligence and stuff like that, went to conferences and we learned from those guys and they send their guys up here and they would train with us. So there's a lot of back and forth as far as training and probably practices, not 100%, but to some degree. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're dealing with a little bit of that in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning in the beginning of each month.
All
Now,
right.
I
Now
want
I'm
to,
done. Go ahead.
yeah, little tangent there.
I needed to know.
All right. What I'd like to go back to just for a quick minute is something that you made a point about, and we did an entire podcast about this, but it was about 3.5 years ago. And I
Mhm.
just was wondering if you could just walk people through really quickly about the number of engagements that the police typically have
Mm.
with people every year, and then just give us a little snapshot of the ethnic demographics, because I think that that surprises a lot of people, that the police have across many jurisdictions and many different types of engagements, not just
Right.
pullovers, but there's millions of engagements that law enforcement have. And
Absolutely.
and yet the perception is that, if a black man leaves the house, he has a high likelihood of getting pulled over and shot by the police. But that's
Right.
actually not the truth of the numbers and the data.
Right. Right. If you want to pull up that PDF that I sent y'all, we
Yeah.
can kind of address that point and I can show specific numbers. This is something that y'all can find online. It's the Dolan Consulting Group, I believe it is, and it's dispelling myths surrounding police uses of lethal force. And it goes into a little bit more than simply lethal force. But if you type that title in, it'll come up, and it is a wealth of knowledge. But if you go to that last page, I think it's page 7, and you scroll down where it says you see that upside down arrow as I mentioned, you see the conclusion area. We can start in where it says conclusion, and I can just read some of it. In this report, several popular claims about the police use of lethal force were carefully examined and were all found to be myths. And again, I encourage anyone listening or watching this, whether you support law enforcement or this whole concept, or whether you're skeptical a bit. I'll go right here. It says, well, while it is unknown how many police citizen contacts occur every year, Studies that examined 3 cities and 3 small towns found that the number of calls for service the police handled averaged out to zero point 0.6 calls per year for each person in the community. And there's some links here as well. As there are 300, and this is a few years old, so it says there are 320, what are we at, 340, 350 million people here in the country, so you have to do whatever averaging you need. As there are 418,000 people residing in the US, that means the police across the nation handled about 192,851,292 calls for service each year, as this does not include proactive stops. So this is calls for service. So-and-so picks up the phone and says, 911, I have a situation here. Can I get some help? So this is what this factored in. As this does not include proactive stops. So if I see someone jaywalking, or if I see a fist fight on the side of the road, or somebody hails me down, that number isn't factored into this equation here. So that would increase the number of police contacts by a significant number. Because I know for a fact that, and I think it depends on certain areas, what we would call self-initiated stops. We had most of us would try to be very proactive, and we would conduct a lot of those self-initiated stops, stopping people. Sometimes you're just trying to get some information about what's going on in an area. You might even be just making small talk. You might even see somebody that you know, want to talk to them for a minute, or you're finding out something else. He talked about there being 321,418 people in the US. They handle police handle around 192 million calls for service. He says, as this does not include proactive stops by officers and informal citizen contacts unrelated to a call for service, been stopped by people who just simply want to say, officer, I just want to thank you for what you do, or asking me questions, directions, things like that. So that is a very common occurrence for law enforcement. We can double this figure to estimate the average number of official police citizen contacts across the nation each year. So if you double that figure, you come up to about, again, this is a few years old, you come up to about 385 million estimated police and citizen contacts per year. 385 million police and citizen contacts per year. I really want that number to sink in for everyone listening, especially if we factor in the number of Black men, unarmed Black men killed by the police. And as we go on, especially as we review this video that you guys want me to, we are all going to be discussing, I really want people to ask themselves an honest question. Do the actions distributed, the emotional displays, and I'm not saying that these people aren't justified in feeling what they feel, but just look at the number of police contacts that take place each year and the number of times you hear about someone being shot by the police. Does the fear equate to the actual fact of the matter? I really want people to really wrestle with that, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. 385 million estimated police citizen contacts. Officers made 11,205,833 criminal arrests, and the average is typically around 10 to 11 million arrests per year. Criminal arrest charges, according to the FBI Uniform Crime Report. And I'll just finish off with this. Out of these 11 million arrests, officers were assaulted 48,315 times, but only 990 deaths of citizens occurred. And that's in totality. You know, there's some years where the number is higher. There've been some years where 2,000 people get shot by the police. And it goes on and say, and I'll wrap it up here, these deaths occurred in only 0.0003% of all police citizen contacts, only 0.009 of all arrest situations, and in only 2.1% of assaults on officer situations. Deaths from police use of force are very unfortunate, often unavoidable, and extremely rare. Look at those numbers, y'all. Honestly, even in situations where an officer has been physically assaulted, the number of times where that escalates to a point where it's deadly force and the suspect ends up dead rarely ever happens. Just think about that number. I think on average in recent years, the number of unarmed Black men, let's just use that reference because that was a very popular narrative and point that was brought up, that's been brought up over the years. On average, that number is about in the teens typically. There's been years where it's been in single digits. But when it's put in front of you, especially a few years ago, 2020, 2021, and years earlier than that, it became less of a talking point in more recent years with the total debacle that was defunding the police came to fruition. After that came, the people saw how chaotic that was was tossed out. You hardly ever heard about anyone talking about police brutality. Of course, there would be some incidents here and there, but was it a national narrative? I would argue that it died out. When they saw that once the police were withdrawing from a lot of these areas that they were claiming were being overly policed, but then they saw the repercussion of that, the homicide rate literally doubled in the Black community when police officers withdrew from a lot of these communities. But everybody was screaming and crying, saying that the number one threat to a young Black man is a police officer. Bull crap. Excuse my language, y'all, but that was nonsense. And that was a lie from the pit of hell. Straight up, there's no other way around. But yet they drove that, they repeated it over and over and over again to a point where people will look at it, and if CNN said it or their local news network said it, then it must be true because everybody's repeating it. And if you're not taking the time to go and do the research and go do the studying, why would you believe that they would lie? But it turned out to be there was I don't know if we'll even get into it now, but I think that there was a much bigger agenda at play, a very deep, dark political agenda in my mind to really manipulate people and tearing down certain facets of our society. And the justice system was one of them, and lives were lost as a result of that.
Wow, that is so true, and maybe hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah.
Because that's a lot to talk. That's a whole show all by itself.
The heart of BTS is first and foremost to be faithful. Faithful to the Word of God, to the sufficiency of Scripture, to knowing we serve a sovereign Lord. The second component of the heart of BTS is accessibility. We're affordable, we're flexible, we work with students to help them achieve goals. This isn't our journey, it's your journey for serving the Lord. It's your journey that God has called you to. So we pray that while God expands and grows the opportunities that we have, that we never lose sight to provide quality, reformed theological education, faithfully and accessibly, so that we can serve the local church by building leaders for His kingdom.
Let's go back to, this idea of, police and citizens in the community, especially Black citizens, and this hostility that's there, the rumored hostility and things like that. And as soon as, police officers see people, then they want to, what was what we say back in the day? They wanted to get froggy. They wanted to leap. They were ready to
Feel froggy jump, that thing.
they wanted to, they were ready and already just aggravated. Was that like your experience? What do you think police officers go into some of these stops with the mindset of?
Multifaceted. I really want to dive into this here deeply. A lot of times when discussions are had about how people should react when they're dealing with law enforcement, people step into that assuming that the officer has ill intention. And as I said from the beginning, and I've said throughout all of my content that addresses law enforcement related issues, that can be a factor. We're humans, we're human beings. Every cop out there ain't trying to police righteously. So some cops may go in there because he's got a racist motive, or he could just be a jerk who hates the people that he polices. But you also have to figure in the fact that sometimes people do bad things. And so when I approached the vehicle, this is what we were taught in the academy. Let me back up a little bit. The vast majority of police killings where police officers are killed occur during a vehicle stop and during a domestic violence call.
Hmm.
Domestic violence call, a lot of emotion. You have people in a rage sometimes, and you're there to try to bring things down. So those calls can be some of the most threatening, and the stats pretty much back that up. But a vehicle stop, you're stopping God knows who at Lord only knows what hour during the day. It could be 3:00 in the afternoon, well-lit area, well-populated area, or it could be 2:00 in the morning. Somebody could be driving and they have no plates, no registration, and that's your job. I'm walking up on this vehicle and I have no idea of who I'm stopping, for very little idea, I should say. I don't know what their mindset is. I don't know whether they are a soccer mom coming home from taking their kids to a game, or whether this dude is a 5-time felon. He's got a trunk load of methamphetamines, and he's thinking to himself, I'm not going back to prison. So when I stop a vehicle, I'm going in there with the same mindset, cautious, mindful of what's going on, with my safety as my first priority. Of course, I'm concerned about the individual in the vehicle. I'm concerned about their safety as well. But my top priority is making sure, my first priority is making sure that I make it home at the end of the night. So most officers are going into a police encounter with that in mind. And I think more citizens need to be aware of that fact. So if a cop is, I'm not saying he's going to be jumpy. Most officers who've had any amount of experience should be pretty calm. But if you're doing whatever you want to do with your hands, if you're hiding your hands down, let's say you're in a person stop, you're walking down the street, a cop stops you, and you got your hands in your pocket, a good cop is going to tell you to take your hands out of your pockets. And why is he doing that? Because he has no idea what you have in your pockets. You could have a pocket knife, you could have a gun, you could have a screwdriver, and next thing you know, I'm fighting for my life. So little things like that, it's a two-way street. A cop shouldn't be walking around gun shy, thinking that everybody he's coming in contact with is a serial killer, but there's a possibility that they could be a serial killer. So it's on, the onus is on both members of the police encounter, both of us to act a certain way. If you catch an attitude, but let's say there is a bank robbery up the street, and they say the suspect is a bald-headed black man with a gray and black beard, with a black t-shirt, dark skin, 6'2", about 230 pounds, walking down the street. And I happen to be walking down that street. I expect that police officer, a good cop, to stop me and pull me over, or conduct a stop. And it might even be a high-risk stop. He might even come out of his car with his gun pointed at me. But he's not doing it simply because I'm a black man. There is a reality to matching the description of a suspect. I've stopped people on multiple occasions, people who got an attitude with me, and then once all the call was over with, and I found out that they weren't the suspect we were looking for, I said, do me a favor, man, come over here. And I have them come around to my car, and I told them to look at my in-vehicle computer. I'm like, what does that say right there? Suspect was wearing such and such. And I'm like, what are you wearing? Now, if you were the victim of that crime, and knowing these details, what would you want me to do if I saw you? And 9 times out of 10, people have been, yeah, right. I'm sorry, officer, I understand. But it took me just taking a few extra moments to explain to him why I stopped him. And a lot of times officers were able to de-escalate situations. So I think, again, in closing on that topic, it's the onus is on both members of a stop, because the officer's demeanor could play a big role. The officer does have reason to be concerned, because we do get killed, we do get assaulted, we do get attacked, and the number of it's not that it happens every single day, but they do happen. So we're the ones out there who go to work with a bulletproof vest on, a gun belt, guns, ammo, baton, pepper spray, taser, handcuffs. That's part of our everyday work gear. Who does that other than law enforcement, or somebody in law enforcement? Nobody. So you go into work, putting yourself in harm's way as a part of your job. Am I asking for sympathy for law enforcement? No, but a level of understanding when it comes to what officers are often faced with and the true nature and potential dangers of the job that they do.
Well, on the other side of that equation, let's talk about when someone does get pulled over, what should they do? Like, how can they see the flashing lights? What should be their end of responsibility, and how they show up to that incident well?
Right. I think, and it's easier said than done, because even when I get pulled over, I get nervous. So it's easier said than done. But the first thing I want to say is, don't panic. Don't freak out. You pull over to the side of the road, not like slamming on your brakes. You gradually pull over to the side of the road. You stop, put it in park, roll down your window, keep your hands visible to where the officer can see them, and you wait for the officer to come by and ask you, the questions that he's going to ask you. But your demeanor can go a very long way in a police encounter, a very long way. If you go into it, I had a good friend of mine. She would tell me, she'd be like, Eric, these officers get on my nerves when they be stopping me. When they stop me, I always want to tell. She wouldn't say she wanted to tell him. She would tell him, you ain't got nobody better to arrest. And I was just like, why would you do that? I'm like, you're asking for a ticket because you're just having a passionate attitude. And so your demeanor can go a long way. But the main thing is to remain calm, pull over safely, and keep your hands visible, and just respond professionally, respectfully to the police officer's commands and directions. And I'm telling you, that will eliminate 90+% of any issues you may be having or fears you have in a police encounter.
So when Monique got pulled over recently, one of the things,
Her fault, totally her fault.
we were hungry. It was late.
It was.
We were trying to make it to Walmart before they closed.
I can't lie.
But one of the things I noticed that she did was she rolled down her window. She kept her hands on the steering wheel. And then when the officer came up, he was very polite, but she said, I can show you my driver's license, but I have to reach in the back to get it. So informing the officer before making any quick moves, that might be something we want to talk to our kids about, of, asking permission or informing what's going to happen. Yeah, I don't know. That was just something I observed that you did. I thought, oh, that was a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, but I've had the talk. And so, even helping him to observe what I was actually doing. Like I told him, my hand, as you can see, both of my hands are on the steering wheel right now. Like
right.
But to me, that's just like second knowledge. It's been so ingrained in me as to what to do at a traffic stop, making sure my radio's off and he doesn't have to speak over it, making sure that my hands are on the steering wheel at all times, except for when I roll down my window, that I'm not, doing any, like, even if because he didn't ask me for my license after all. He asked me for it and I said, well, it's in the back. I'd have to turn around and get it. He was like, no, that's okay. But even if I had to, I said, okay, well, now I'm going to turn around because you've already given me the permission to turn around. And I would have asked him, would you like me to roll down the back window so you can see that there's nothing back here? Because it was night and my windows were a little tinted, and you know what I mean? But man, getting pulled over is stressful. And I think when you have some of that like other stuff lying under the current, let me ask this, because we started out just even by talking about like the things that I did when I got pulled over recently, but those things were in me just subconsciously because of the things that I had learned from my mom as a young child. I want to show a video of like adults, parents talking to their kids
Having the
about
talk.
kind of having the talk, but also telling them about their experience with being pulled over by police. And I want to get your reaction. You can have a stop it. We'll play it in real time, and you can, kind of give your comments on it. And then I have questions for you about like how young is too young to talk to your kids, or is there ever a time when they're too young? And some of the things that I think our culture, maybe more than the quote unquote white culture, does that may or may not be helpful when talking to kids about police. So let's roll that clip.
We actually have a line that we do at our house. We practice this thing. What is it?
I'm Ariel Sky Williams. I'm 8 years old. I'm unarmed and I have nothing that will hurt you.
It's just kind of a thing we practice at our house. There are great police officers out there. There's also some police officers who are not so good.
And my fear is that you run across one of those bad ones.
For some reason, people of color have always been a target by the police.
When people say in the 21st century that Black people are typically the target of law enforcement, that always bothers me. And I know that is a popular narrative out there that somehow we are unjustly, because it kind of assumes that it's an unjust targeting. And I know people get fired up and they get upset about this, but there's a reality that there are some issues in the Black community in related to crime. Now, it is a very small percentage of the Black community. Let me just lay that out there. But when we look at the violent crime statistics over the last, just go 20 years, you'll see that when it comes to violent crime, homicides, robberies, you'll see that unfortunately, some of our young Black men seem to be more prone to want to commit these crimes. So him just saying blanketly that Black folks seem to be a target, an unjust target of law enforcement contact, of law enforcement interactions, I think that's unfair. And I think that, and we're going to see as the video progresses, a lot of emotion being displayed, especially on the part of these young kids. And it really breaks my heart because they're being fed and again, remember the statistics that I laid out for y'all in the beginning of the program. And this is the area I was talking about. Does the way they feel, is it justified knowing the facts and reality in related to police and citizen interactions?
Before they became a policeman, they were a person. And that person took all their ideas and all their thoughts and all their prejudice into their job.
Why would a police officer assume that you did something bad? Maybe because of my skin color.
So there's a reality that cops are human beings, and we bring our presuppositions, our biases, our beliefs into work, just like everybody does. Everybody does that. And I'm not saying that as a way to excuse a police officer, but it's a reality. And that could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. But we have to understand, and I just want to say this, we have to understand that I don't think that there's any entity in our country that has the levels of checks and balances to monitor and dictate their behavior like there is with law enforcement. And some of that is due to past atrocities, past misbehaviors, past crimes, however you want to term it, however you want to break it down, describe it. But when it comes to our actions are dictated on the federal, state, county, and city level. How we stop people, who we can stop, when we can stop them. There were times where I would do a police stop and somebody would match the description of a crime or a suspect in a crime, we would have the suspect stand nearby, and a victim or a witness in the crime would be in the police vehicle, and they would drive by and they would take a glance, and they would see if that was the person who committed the crime. But if I did that,
I've
I
actually
couldn't
been a
have
part of that.
yeah, I couldn't have my lights on my police car.
Mhm.
I couldn't be standing next to them. I couldn't have them in front of my police car. And why is that? Because it could taint that person into thinking that, well, if the cops have the lights on and if they got them in front of their vehicle and they got them handcuffed, then he must be the person who committed the crime. So they figured that it could influence the witness into believing that that person was the suspect when they weren't. So I say all that to say that there's so many factors that go into what we can do and when we can do it. And not to mention our very own department policies. We had a multi-100-page department policy book as to everything that we did. Handcuffing techniques, takedowns, when we're supposed to use deadly force, when not to use deadly force. So many different factors. There's no agency that has the same level of scrutiny, not even our teachers, not even them that deal with our kids on a more intimate level have the same standard. Now, granted, I know that teachers aren't stopping crime and they don't have the same power and authority, but they have a very close level of influence to young people. But so the fear, I really want people to think about the fear that's being displayed and just how people are talking about cops. Not every cop is going to be racist. Known cops that were on the suspect side when it came to race, just in casual conversation. But the way they police within the law. They police within our policies. They really limited themselves to doing things the right way. And everybody has a bias. White cops have biases. Black cops have biases. And everybody's prone to bring it into their work. And the point when the little girl was breaking down, that's one of the things that really bothered me while I was watching this video, was because it was just assumed that the reason, and I know they said more to it than that, but she got emotional because she could be walking down the street and a cop could approach her and want to talk to her, and she could totally freak out and react in a way to where she puts herself in harm's way unnecessarily. Because to some degree, some of these parents are creating a phobia within their kids that the cops are going to hunt them down and shoot them. What was the LeBron James some years ago during the George Floyd incident, talking about it was a Ahmaud Arbery case. We can't even walk down the street without being hunted down. And that just really pisses me off because it ain't like that. There, however many tens of millions of us there are, because people debate the number. But when you look at the sheer number of us that get killed, Black folks, it is ridiculously small and ridiculously low. But yet but when these very biased media outlets constantly, or especially back in the day, a few years ago, they're so used to harping on some of these issues. I think it would naturally cause some of these kids, some kids may want to run if they're stopped by a police officer, because he could be stopping you because you're Black. Well, cops have a tendency to want to target Black folks. So-and-so got shot. I want to make sure you make it home. And I think it's good to have that discussion. Some of these things need to be addressed. But if you're having it with a very limited perspective, if all you think about is the fact that some Black men have been shot by a small number of police officers, and a very small percentage may have done it because they were racially motivated, if that's the message you're feeding into your kids, you're doing them a disservice, which kind of goes into like that course that course that I created. I tried to create a course because I grew up thinking that Black people were totally just in being fearful of law enforcement. I really believed that for a lot of my life. And we're talking the 70s and 80s, so we are talking about a different period in our country's history. We weren't that far removed from the civil rights legislation all being passed, and racism was a real thing. I dealt with it on an almost daily basis. But our world is in a completely different place, and no one's going to change my mind on that.
Mhm.
And the way officers police is radically different over the last 50 years, radically different. And that number is just proven by anyone willing to do the research.
What really struck me though with that girl, there's kind of this seed that's planted. This is what I see as a mom is I'm not sure that girl was as afraid of the police before that conversation started as she was by the end of the conversation. That there were seeds that were planted there of, oh, I need to be afraid. I'm going to be targeted. This is why they're questioning me, is because of my race.
I didn't take it that way. When my automatic assumption was that she's had these conversations. Like, this isn't a new conversation.
So either way, I just thought it's kind of sad if from a parental perspective to plant that thought,
but
that may or may not be grounded in reality.
But see, I think that the flip side of that conversation would say that this is reality. And so I'm doing all that I can to protect my child so that they come home. And I can understand that, like, having grown up with that, I understand the heart and the intention behind it is so that your child can come home the same way you would tell your kid, make sure you drive with your lights on, make sure you have your lights on, make sure you have your light, because I want you to come home at the end of the day. I think that this is for many Black parents who haven't done the research, who don't, know the stats and data.
But it might even be a white parent with an adoptive child.
Yeah. So anyone who believes this rhetoric or has been told this and maybe hasn't done the data on it, but all they do is they see, what's being repeated in media.
Yeah.
To them, it's as simple as, hey, I'm trying to get you to turn your lights on so that you can come home, so that people can see you and you remain safe and you get to come home to me. That is, it's a conversation of love and of care. And it's not a conversation to build some, like, unrealistic fear. There should be fear because this is the way that police deal with Black people, according to, like, if I was to believe that.
All right,
I would say that it's the intention of the parents are good. Like, obviously these parents are concerned about their kids.
Sure.
I just think unfortunately they're kind of ill-informed.
I remember being put in handcuffs for something that had nothing to do with me. I was literally walking in the mall. Cops slammed me on the ground, busted my lip, chipped my tooth. That actually made me really mad.
How about the time they pulled us over with me in the car and arrested me and left all of you guys sitting in the car, nobody knew how to drive on the side of the road because the bumper on the car was kind of hanging off?
No.
We live in Puyallup. There's people that don't even have a bumper on their car.
My rear brake light wasn't working, and I got to my destination and they were working.
I was about your age, actually. They grabbed me.
Why?
I didn't know at the time. They just grabbed me. They threw me onto the police car.
I got tased that time. That time they tased me because they said I wasn't complying.
Ariel, are you okay?
What's wrong, baby?
What's up right there? One thing I've learned throughout my law enforcement career is that there are always two sides to every story. Every story. I hear a lot of people, I've been on calls, let's take a domestic violence call, where somebody called and said, he slapped me and I want him to go to jail. But then, so that's the first bit of information you get. Then you talk to the male half of the situation, and he says that he came after me with a knife or a stick or tried to throw some hot water on me. And I was trying to get whatever it was, the weapon out of her hand, and I did hit her. And then you talk to the next door neighbor who says that he threatened him on multiple occasions. I saw what happened and she did come after him. But the initial story was that she played victim. And I don't know the situation that these individuals are talking about. But what I do know is that there in many situations, like I said earlier on, could there be times where police officers are just abusing their power? Yeah. But could that person have done something that put them in that situation? That's equally true. That's an equally true possibility as well. So we need to not assume because someone is displaying a large amount of emotion, causing their kid to cry, or they plead a case, that everything that they're telling you is 100% of the facts in circumstances involved in their encounters. I don't know, but I don't want anybody just listening to that and walking away saying, see, police just always abusing Black folks. Yeah. You shouldn't assume that. You should assume that there's a possibility that there could be more going on in this situation. But my point is the narrative got ahead of the facts. And I want us to be able to look at these situations and just ask questions and be reasonable and not just get caught up in our emotions because they're creating an environment, creating a scene. You see these sweet little kids terrified, hearing about their parents going through something or being put in a situation to be fearful. And it just there's a possibility that there could be a whole lot more going on than meets the eye or than what we're hearing.
I think that's very good, insight as like, hey, there are two sides to every story. And as you've already mentioned, yes, there are, bad cops, but there are a ton of good cops. And look at the data, how many interactions are police having? And out of all those interactions, how many people are actually, injured or wind up shot
Right.
or things like that. So I think that's all, very helpful information. We'll put the rest of this video in the show notes in case you want to see the rest of the video for our viewers at home or our listeners. I do want to keep going and ask a question in regards to kids, because I remember having this conversation when I was very little. My brother also had the conversation when he was very little. There were little kids on the video. How young is too young to have conversations about, interactions with the police with children?
Well, I think if your kids are old enough, and I think it's up to the parent, of course. Ultimately, it's their discretion. But if your kids are old enough to maybe go play, being out on their own, where you don't feel like you have to keep an eye on them, I think that's a good place to start having subtle, simple conversations with them about how they interact with police. Now, the police are very limited in what they can ask or how far they can question a child.
Hmm.
So there are limitations there. And I want anyone listening to make sure you check with your local jurisdiction and find out what the laws are in your city, state, or county when it comes to police interviews and stuff like that, and your rights as a parent and the rights of the child. So make sure you check that out and kind of caveat everything I'm saying with that fact, with that reality. But I think if your kids can be out on their own playing and you trust them to know their way home and not go too far, it's good to have that conversation because you never know what situation or incident they'll find themselves in. So they need to know that 9 times out of 10, if not even 99% of the time, the cop isn't the enemy. Cop's not the enemy. They're not seeking to do harm to you. They actually may want to be helpful to you. So I think starting having I think at an early age, it's a good thing. It's okay that it's okay for them to start having these conversations. Obviously, as a kid becomes more mature, and that's up to the child, because not every kid is going to be able to take in all this information. But as your kids get older, they need to understand that they do have some rights. They do have rights when it comes to what degree a police officer can interview or interrogate them without their parent present. But also be aware that I think it should be reinforced that the police, you shouldn't be afraid. You shouldn't walk around fearful of the cops, especially if you haven't done anything wrong. If you haven't done anything wrong, I think you're in a safe place to have confidence and to be respectful. I think there's some really basic things. If a cop stops you, say to them, I want to have my parents present. If they can remember that. And that just being courteous and not being rude, and the simple things we talk about. Where are your hands? How's your body language? How are you acting? Remain calm. I've been in situations where I put handcuffs on a child because of how they were acting. I recall one situation where this young kid I think he was really dealing with some mental health issues for a long period of time, and he was threatening to beat up his mom. This kid was like 9 years old, and she was like a grown woman. So, I mean, that's a totally different conversation there. That just kind of blew my mind. And he was saying that he wanted to kill himself. So he wanted to set himself on fire, is what he was saying.
Mm.
So he was just really combative, and I had to put him in handcuffs. So there are situations where that may happen, and the cop may have to use a level of force. And from the outside, it may look bad, but always, like I said, the parent needs to know all the details. And when they get there, because I've seen parents fly onto a scene, run up on a police officer, and they end up getting slammed because they put the officer didn't know what their intentions were. So for the parent who's in that situation, if you pull up on a police encounter and you see the police officer have your kid, they have your child handcuffed in the front of the vehicle or sitting down, start approaching that officer, identify yourself, and start asking questions, and don't approach in an aggressive manner. Again, officers are psychics. They're asked to assess each situation on a moment by moment basis. So your demeanor can play such a massive role in how these situations end up. But when it comes to age, I think that's up to the parent and the maturity of the child primarily.
I think too, what I struggle with in that video is it made me ask a question of at what point does my baggage as a parent, maybe I've had negative interactions with law enforcement, or there are family stories circulating from my grandparents or my great grandparents about negative law enforcement engagements. And at what
Right.
point am I kind of projecting that onto my kids in kind of getting them ready almost to anticipate the same trauma, even though policing is quite a bit different now. And like you said earlier, there are so many policies and regulations that govern law enforcement now and how they interact with the public. At what point am I bringing my own experiences and almost giving my children secondary trauma based on my own experience or the experience of past generations? I don't know. That's one of the things that kind of jumped out at me as I watched that video.
When you brought up the reality that policing isn't what it was, I encourage everyone to find that PDF that I had referenced earlier in the video, because they have some statistics of the number of police shootings, and I've mentioned it on on your show before. They have some stats on the number of police shootings that took place back in the 70s compared to like closer to 2010, 2015. And you will see an astronomical fall in the number of police shootings. Because back in the day, before we had we had laws like Graham versus Connor and Tennessee versus Garner. These are laws that are in place that have been challenged on at the level of the Supreme Court, some of them, that dictate when force can be used, when deadly force can be used. It was before these encounters. So we've learned there have been amendments that come along in various ways to where more handcuffs were put on law enforcement, no pun intended, but justifiably so. Because back in the day, for instance, a fleeing felon, a cop could use deadly force on. But you take a step back, and a felon could be everything from you writing a $10,000 bad check, and you have a felony bad check case against you, or it could be a full-blown homicide. There's a significant difference in when it comes to use of force. Now, if I have a dude who just killed 2 or 3 people and he's running away, I can articulate why I think he might be a threat to the public, where I may need to stop that man immediately. But if I got a grandma who wrote some bad checks, but she still has felony offenses and she decides she wants to get away from me, that's not a situation where you should be pulling a gun out on somebody necessarily. Again, details matter, but just in general, it's not one. So all those factors need to be, kind of taken into consideration. But when you say that the baggage can come along and can impact somebody, it can definitely play a role. And I really want people to understand, again, like I suggested, take some time and go through that PDF. And I think when you're all done, if you weigh the information and even follow up on the stats and facts that they share with you, you'll walk away not being so fearful of cops, because you realize that the chances are very, very, very low that some harm's going to come to you or your child.
I think that there are letters that we get from parents, often they're white parents who have adopted through the foster care system. They've adopted Black and brown children. Sometimes they've engaged in international adoptions. And having what you guys called the talk is part of the training that they get from their adoption agencies, that this is a very important issue that they need to bring up with their children proactively to prepare them for targeting by law enforcement. And again, my concern is that this kind of plants this seed in their mind of, oh, I'm going to be targeted because of my race, rather than, to me, what we're talking about on the show is really just common sense for every parent, regardless of ethnicity, like being respectful to law enforcement, knowing how to engage with them. I'm not really hearing anything in this whole discussion that is particular to Black people. I mean,
no, I don't disagree with you. I think that I don't know if it was 2019 or 2020 where that study came out. It might have been out of Boston College, where within different regions in America, police stops look different. And in the South, Black men are normally like either pulled out or have their vehicle searches at higher rates. And Eric, I don't know if you have read the study or if you know about the data on that, but I remember reading it like probably around 2019, 2020. And it just made me think of, we all want our kids to come home safe. And so I don't know that we need to instill such fear of the way that video did, but how do we just have realistic conversations? But if I do know that I'm in an area where, statistically speaking, these things happen more like this than it would like another way, how do I prepare my child for that?
yeah.
Eric, I definitely would take your insight and wisdom into that. Because I am not one to want to just instill fear into anyone. I think wisdom is different. And so how do we prepare our children wisely if there are higher rates of, something like that? And it was in the southern regions of America. And so, but I should go back and try, and I've said that a couple times, I should try and find that study again.
In the course I created, it's called the Safe Method, the Citizen's Guide to Fearless Police Encounters. If you go to fearlesspolicestops.com, and you can order that course. The vast majority of it is breaking down how the citizen should interact with the police in various situations. But I saved the last portion of it, and I referenced that it could be like the most important portion of the course, but it deals with like if you have a confrontation with a bad cop.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a place for letting people know the vast majority of encounters you have nothing to fear, but also preparing them for the situation, the possible situation that they do run into somebody who has ill will for whatever reason. So that's why I try to create something that was very well-rounded.
Yeah.
I use my life experiences plus my experiences in law enforcement to say, I sat back and I examined the thousands of police stops I was involved in, the hundreds or thousands of police stops that I happen to be an observer as a secondary officer, where I was there to back up another officer. And I just kind of went through all these stops and all these interactions, even interactions I had with people when I worked in the jail, worked in the prison, when I was able to bring situations down, calm people down. So I gave them the perspective of an officer, and I gave them the perspective because I've been a citizen now for, almost 11 years. No badge, none of that. I'm just average everyday guy. When I get stopped on the street, if somebody has an assumption about who I am, I think I've been stopped twice in the last 11 years and never a ticket or anything like that. But I also know how to interact. And I'm not going to lie. I think that throughout the course, I've been a black man all my life. I was a police officer for just a little over 20 years. And I think there's still some ingrained concern that pops up into my head because I heard it from when I was a little kid. And I've had bad interactions with the police when I was a kid. So I think and then I've also seen officers do bad. I think there's a reality and that there are some. And and as much as I say that happens on a very rare basis or very rarely, I think it's also wise to have that conversation as well. Because if you do come across an officer that's trying to violate your rights, trying to abuse you or assault you or attack you, whatever, there are things that you can do also, and you should do to protect yourself. And trying to get into a fight and screaming, shouting match with that officer, that's the worst place you can start off. Do what you can, try to remain calm to the best of your ability, document the encounter to the best of your ability, try to get the name, things like that. Those are things that you can do to protect yourself. So as much as it bothers me seeing these parents really harping in on the mistreatment done by officers, I think that there's a reality to that. Just in some instances. And they say in order to have a full-throated, like a well-rounded conversation, that needs to be addressed. I just don't think that should be at the center of the conversation.
I would definitely say I completely agree, and that these conversations are not just for Black kids. You can come
Right.
across a bad cop regardless of your skin color and regardless of that cop's skin color. And, as you've highlighted, we all come to situations with certain biases or dislikes and prejudices and things like that. And so just raising our kids to understand, like, hey, if this happens, this is what we do. And it's not solely because of the color of your skin, but it's because I do want you to come home safe. And because the officer in front of you is an authority and we respect authority. And this is what wisdom looks like. And so I'm glad that you've highlighted that and given us some really good things to think about in how we, have these conversations with our kids, because it is really important. And it's not simply the Black conversation or the conversation that Black people
Right.
must have with their kids, or people who are parenting Black kids, must have. So thank you very much. We are very grateful that you stopped by to have this conversation with us.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. And again, this conversation is one that I think, yeah, the talk is, I think it's needed, but I think it's not just for, young black kids. I think it's for everyone because not everyone is respectful of authority. And if we want to be consistently biblical, respecting authority is paramount. That's everywhere in the scriptures.
Yeah.
So we want to raise our kids to be godly, to, in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Respecting authority is someplace that, we also want to focus on. Respecting authority is something we want to focus on as well.
We want to put your website up where people can get your training course. It's fearlesspolicestops.com. And this is where they can get your safe course.
Yes,
And then they
ma'am.
can also find you on YouTube at Code Red Conversations, right?
Absolutely, 100%. I've branched out into making content, dealing with a few more issues than simply policing. But when it's all said and done, I'm an old retired cop, and that's kind of a place where my heart is. So I'll always be addressing some of those issues as well. And if you just want to see me on Facebook, Eric L. Muldrow, I'm on Facebook, irritating folks, talking politics, talking things of God, whatever, that's what I do. Being silly, that's just what I do.
Awesome. Well, we are grateful for you taking the time to hang out with us tonight.
Thanks, Eric.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Well, that was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of good wisdom. And I think the main takeaway that I hope people take away from this is that, one, the statistics don't match the narrative.
But if you see that video, they just like selectively put back to back to back, and it paints a picture that feeds that narrative.
But the statistics don't match the narrative.
I
And
know.
so we need to have better conversations about reality. What is reality? And I know what might have happened to your grandmama, 70 years ago or, things like
Yeah.
that. But what's happening today? Let's live in today in reality. And so that was one of the things that I thought
Yeah.
was very helpful and important that he brought up. But then too, is that this talk that, is highlighted in Black culture is
Or
really,
in the adoption community.
and in the adoption community. But I think it stems from the Black culture.
Yeah.
And so now I have a kid in my home, if I am, not Black, I have a kid in my home who still can be viewed as being a part of that. And so now we must continue this legacy of the talk.
Yeah.
And in reality, that talk should be something that all parents give to their kids, because all parents should be wanting to instill in their kids respect for authority, understanding their legal rights. Like, you have a right, also as children. And that, in the heat of the moment, when you're very upset and emotional, that might not be the best time to advocate for why you think you're right.
Yeah, and I was thinking about our past conversation with our friend Mark Perez, our other law enforcement friend, and something he talked about in that conversation was about how, and Eric briefly alluded to this, but how to keep records of the interaction. And if you have to make a report about a bad interaction, that you can do that, and that's a recourse for people as well. But this is a good conversation, and Eric just brings a ton of wisdom to the issues and perspective from the law enforcement side of things, because often the media just wants to get everybody in our emotions.
Well, and there's benefit to the media getting us in our emotions. And so we also have to remember that. We should be, especially as believers, seekers of truth, always looking for evidence, before we go and and judge the situation. What is the evidence? What is the truth? How are we seeking truth in those matters?
That's really good.
Yeah. So
make sure to join us next week. We're going to be having a live show with our friends from the Brave Parenting podcast. They're going to be coming by to give us some great wisdom related to helping our kids navigate technology, social media. Their whole ministry is geared toward equipping teachers, parents, child influencers, how to help our kids navigate those things. And I've been on their podcast. You're going to be on their podcast this season. And so we want to introduce you to our friends and let you know about what they're doing. So we will see you next week.
Yes.